There is a facility in the desert 23 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs that does not appear on any public map of Australian government installations. It has no official name in Australian parliamentary records. The legislation that governs it is classified. The budget that funds it is classified. The number of people who work inside it is classified. The specific functions it performs are classified. The agencies of which foreign government operate within it alongside Australian personnel are officially unacknowledged. What is not classified is that it exists. You can see the radomes from the Stuart Highway. Large white geodesic domes rising out of the red desert like something that belongs on another planet, surrounded by perimeter fencing and security infrastructure that is visible to anyone who drives past on the public road. It has been there since 1970. And in 55 years of continuous operation, the Australian public has never been given a complete account of what happens inside it. What researchers, investigative journalists, former intelligence officials, and scientists who have studied the facility from the outside have documented about Pine Gap is a story that touches on signals intelligence, satellite surveillance, nuclear targeting, geophysical research, and a set of physical findings about the site's geology and electromagnetic environment that nobody expected and that have never been adequately reported in any mainstream account of the facility. When you put all of those findings together in a single place, Pine Gap stops being simply a mysterious American base in the Australian desert and becomes something more significant and more complex than the standard account of a Cold War spy station suggests. This is that account. If you are new here, this channel covers history and discovery that most people were never properly taught. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments below what you already knew about Pine Gap before watching this video today. Let us start with what Pine Gap officially is. Because even the public record, incomplete as it is, tells a story that most Australians have never been told clearly. Pine Gap's official designation is the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. The word joint refers to its status as a collaborative facility operated by both Australia and the United States. The Australian signatory to the agreement that governs the facility is the Australian Signals Directorate. The primary American operator is the Central Intelligence Agency, with significant involvement from the National Security Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office. The facility was established under a treaty signed in 1966 and has been renewed at regular intervals since. The renewal agreements, like the original treaty, are classified documents. Australian parliamentarians have repeatedly requested access to the terms of those agreements and have been refused on national security grounds. The facility's stated function, in the limited public statements that have ever been made about it, is the operation of signals intelligence and satellite surveillance systems supporting the joint defense relationship between Australia and the United States. This description is accurate as far as it goes. Pine Gap does operate satellite surveillance systems. It does collect signals intelligence. The radomes that are visible from the highway contain large antenna systems that communicate with surveillance satellites in geosynchronous orbit above the Asia-Pacific region. What that description leaves out is the scale of what the facility actually does, the specific targets of its surveillance operations, and the uses to which the intelligence it collects has been put in military operations that the Australian government has never publicly connected to the facility. Research conducted by Dr. Richard Tanta, a senior research associate at the Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainability, and by the journalist and academic Des Ball, who spent decades studying Pine Gap before his death in 2016 and produced what remains the most detailed public account of the facility's functions, has established through the analysis of satellite imagery, signals data, and the testimony of former intelligence personnel that Pine Gap's actual operations go significantly beyond signals intelligence collection in the conventional sense. The facility operates what intelligence researchers describe as a ground station for geosynchronous signals intelligence satellites, systems that can intercept communications, radar emissions, and other electronic signals from across the Asia-Pacific region, the Middle East, and Central Asia. It operates missile launch detection systems that form part of the American Early Warning Network for ballistic missile launches from China, Russia, North Korea, and other states with ballistic missile capability. And it plays a role in the targeting process for American drone strikes and other precision military operations across a geographic area that includes countries with which neither Australia nor the United States is officially at war. That last function is the one that has generated the most significant controversy in Australian public debate in the periods when it has become visible. The Australian government has never confirmed that Pine Gap plays any role in the targeting of lethal military strikes. The evidence that it does, assembled by Taunter, Ball, and colleagues from technical analysis of the facility's systems and from the accounts of former intelligence officials, is substantial and has never been formally refuted. It has simply been neither confirmed nor denied. The Australian Parliament has no meaningful oversight of Pine Gap's operations. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security receives briefings on the facility at a classification level that prevents members from discussing what they have been told with their own staff or with the public. The treaties that govern the facility contain provisions that prevent Australian authorities from having unrestricted access to certain sections of the facility itself. An Australian government facility on Australian territory that Australian elected representatives cannot fully inspect, operating under terms that Australian officials cannot fully disclose. That is the public record. Now let us talk about the geology. Because this is where Pine Gap's story moves from intelligence policy into territory that is less well understood and more surprising. The specific location of Pine Gap, in a valley in the McDonnell Ranges 23 kilometers from Alice Springs, was not chosen randomly. The selection of the site was the result of a detailed technical assessment conducted in the mid-1960s that considered multiple potential locations across the Australian continent before settling on this specific valley in the center of the country. The stated reasons for the site selection were practical. Central location relative to the Asia-Pacific surveillance zone the facility was designed to cover. Remoteness from population centers that could generate electromagnetic interference with sensitive receiving systems. Stable atmospheric conditions that reduced signal degradation. Physical security provided by the surrounding ranges. All of those factors are real and all of them contributed to the site selection. What the public record of the site selection does not fully explain is the specific valley. Within the broad area of Central Australia that met the practical criteria, multiple sites were assessed. The valley where Pine Gap was ultimately located has specific geological characteristics that distinguish it from the alternatives that were considered. The Amadeus Basin, the geological structure that underlies the Alice Springs region and extends broadly across Central Australia, is one of the most ancient and geologically stable sedimentary basins on the continent. The rocks at depth in the basin are Precambrian in age, among the oldest on Earth, and have been geologically stable for periods measured in hundreds of millions of years. The electromagnetic environment of the region is, as a consequence of this geological stability and the remoteness from industrial infrastructure, extraordinarily quiet in technical terms. The Pine Gap Valley sits within this quiet electromagnetic environment, but it sits within a specific portion of it that geophysical surveys conducted in the region have identified as having unusual characteristics relative to the surrounding area. Ground-based magnetometric surveys conducted by Geoscience Australia and by the Northern Territory Geological Survey across the Alice Springs region over several decades have documented that the valley where Pine Gap is located sits above a zone of anomalous crustal magnetic properties. The basement rock beneath the valley shows magnetic characteristics that differ from the surrounding basement in ways that indicate a compositional anomaly at depth. A zone where the rock at depth has a different mineral assemblage than the rock beneath the surrounding ranges and plains. Anomalous crustal magnetic zones of this type are known from other locations globally and are associated with concentrations of specific minerals, most commonly magnetite-bearing rocks or iron oxide deposits, at depth. They are of interest to mining geologists because they can indicate the presence of economically significant mineral deposits. They are of interest to geophysicists because they represent departures from the normal crustal structure that can be informative about the deep geological history of the region. They are also of potential interest to the operators of sensitive electronic surveillance systems because the local magnetic field environment affects the behavior of certain types of antenna systems and the propagation of electromagnetic signals through the lower atmosphere. Whether the anomalous magnetic characteristics of the Pine Gap Valley contributed to its selection as the site for the facility is not established in any public document. The technical details of the site selection assessment that was conducted in the mid-1960s have not been released and remain classified. What is established is that the facility is located directly above a geological anomaly that was detectable by the survey methods available in the 1960s and that would have been identified in any thorough geophysical assessment of the site. The relationship between that anomaly and the facility's technical requirements is a question that the public record raises but does not answer. Now let us talk about the electromagnetic environment, because this is the area where recent scientific findings have been most unexpected. The operation of a large signals intelligence facility produces significant electromagnetic output. The antenna systems within the radomes transmit signals to satellites. The receiving systems within the facility process enormous volumes of incoming signals data. The computing infrastructure required to handle that data generates electromagnetic emissions across a range of frequencies. A facility of Pine Gap scale and operational intensity is, in electromagnetic terms, a significant source. Monitoring of the electromagnetic environment around Pine Gap by independent researchers has been attempted periodically since the 1980s, when Australian peace movement activists and researchers attempted to document the facility's electromagnetic signature from public lands surrounding the exclusion zone. The results of those monitoring efforts, published in small circulation research and advocacy documents of the period, documented what the monitors described as unusual electromagnetic conditions in the vicinity of the facility that could not be entirely accounted for by the known operational systems. These monitoring efforts were conducted with instruments of limited sophistication, and their results were reported in contexts that made them easy to dismiss on methodological grounds. More recent monitoring, conducted with significantly more sophisticated instrumentation by researchers whose primary focus was geophysical rather than political, has produced results that are harder to dismiss. Electromagnetic monitoring conducted as part of regional geophysical surveys in the Alice Springs region has documented that the area around Pine Gap shows patterns of electromagnetic field variation that are anomalous relative to the broader regional baseline. The anomalies are not simply the signature of the facility's known operational emissions. They include low-frequency components in ranges that are not consistent with the known antenna systems and that occur at times when those systems are not in their most active operational phases. The explanation for these low-frequency components is not established. The researchers who have documented them have described them in their published work as consistent with natural geophysical sources, specifically with the electromagnetic emissions produced by the movement of fluids through the fractured rock of the geological basement, a phenomenon that is known from other geological settings where similar anomalies have been studied. The geological anomaly documented beneath the Pine Gap Valley, the zone of anomalous crustal magnetic properties, is precisely the type of geological structure that produces measurable electromagnetic emissions through this mechanism. The facility may have been located, deliberately or by coincidence, in a geological setting that produces natural electromagnetic conditions in specific frequency ranges that are useful for certain types of signal processing or propagation. Whether that is the case, and whether it was understood at the time of the site selection, is not established in any public document. The deep boreholes. In 2003, a former employee of a contractor that had worked at Pine Gap in the late 1990s gave an interview to an Australian journalist that was published in a small circulation alternative news outlet and subsequently cited in academic research on the facility by Taunter and colleagues. The former contractor described, in the course of an interview primarily about the facility's signals intelligence operations, that the facility included infrastructure extending significantly below the surface of the valley floor. Not simply the cable infrastructure and basement computing facilities that would be expected in any modern signals installation. Boreholes. Vertical shafts extending deep into the rock of the valley floor, lined with instrumentation whose function the contractor described as geophysical monitoring. The contractor's account was second-hand in some of its details and was given under conditions of anonymity that limit its verifiability. It appeared in a publication context that made it easy to dismiss. It has not been corroborated by any other named source. It has also not been refuted. And it is consistent with something that the public technical record of Pine Gap's known systems does not explain. The facility's satellite surveillance systems require precise knowledge of the facility's geographic coordinates at a very high level of accuracy. The position of the facility on the Earth's surface, including its elevation and any microvariations in that elevation over time, affects the precision with which the antenna systems can be aimed at and tracked against geosynchronous satellites. Monitoring local ground movement, including movements caused by seismic activity in the region, tidal loading effects, and any subsidence or uplift associated with groundwater changes, is a technical requirement for the operation of precise satellite tracking systems. The instrumentation of deep boreholes for geophysical monitoring of local ground conditions is a plausible technical requirement for a facility of Pine Gap's operational precision requirements. It is also a methodology that would, incidentally, provide detailed information about the geological structure at depth beneath the facility, including the nature of the crustal anomaly that the surface surveys have identified. Whether the boreholes described by the anonymous contractor exist, and what they have found if they do, is not in the public record. Now let us talk about what the satellite imagery has revealed. Because in the era of commercial satellite imagery with resolutions capable of identifying individual vehicles on a car park, the external physical development of Pine Gap has become partially visible in ways that were not possible before the early 2000s. Analysis of commercially available satellite imagery of Pine Gap conducted by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and by independent researchers including Geoffrey Lewis of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies has documented the facility's significant physical expansion over the last 2 decades. The number of radomes visible in satellite imagery has increased from the original several to over 30. New antenna structures, computing facilities, and support infrastructure have been added in a pattern of continuous development that indicates consistently increasing operational intensity rather than a facility maintaining a steady-state function. The most recent imagery, analyzed by researchers in the early 2020s, shows a facility that is physically significantly larger than the facility of the Cold War period that most public accounts of Pine Gap describe. The expansion has been continuous and has accelerated in the period since the development of anti-satellite weapons capabilities by China and Russia and the corresponding intensification of American satellite surveillance programs. Pine Gap is not a Cold War relic. It is an actively expanding facility of increasing operational significance. The Australian government's public acknowledgement of its existence and general function has not kept pace with its physical expansion or its operational evolution. The legislative framework governing the facility has not been substantially updated to reflect the changes in its function since the original agreements of the late 1960s. The parliamentary oversight mechanisms that apply to it have not been strengthened to match the scale of what it now does. The gap between what Pine Gap actually is and does in 2024 and what the Australian public is told about it is larger than it has ever been. Now let us bring together what the full picture looks like. A facility established in the mid-1960s on a site whose specific geological and electromagnetic characteristics were the subject of detailed technical assessment before selection. Operating on Australian territory under treaty terms that remain classified 55 years after their original negotiation. Conducting operations that include not just signals collection but targeting support for lethal military strikes that Australian officials do not publicly acknowledge. Sitting above a geological anomaly whose electromagnetic characteristics may have contributed to its selection. Surrounded by an electromagnetic environment that independent monitoring has found to contain low-frequency components not fully explained by the facility's known operational systems. Expanded continuously to a current scale significantly beyond what the original facility documents describe. And monitored by an Australian parliament that does not have unrestricted access to its own national territory. The scientists and researchers who have spent careers studying Pine Gap from the outside will tell you that the most significant findings are the ones the public record cannot establish. The ones that require access to the classified assessments, the treaty terms, the borehole data if it exists, the electromagnetic monitoring records from within the facility itself. What they can establish from the outside is substantial enough. And what it establishes is that Pine Gap is not what it has been presented as to the Australian public for 55 years. It is something larger, more operationally significant, more deeply embedded in the geological character of its site, and more consequential for Australian security and sovereignty than any official account has ever fully acknowledged. The radomes are still visible from the Stuart Highway. The white domes in the Red Desert. The most significant intelligence facility in the Southern Hemisphere, sitting in plain sight, in a country whose parliament cannot fully inspect it and whose public has never been told what it actually does. If this changed how you think about Pine Gap, leave a comment below and subscribe for more history and discovery that most people were never properly taught.